The story of Joan of Arc is often painted in the shimmering gold of cathedral altars and the soft whites of divine purity, a simplified portrait of a peasant girl who heard the whispers of angels and saved a kingdom. But to truly understand the Maid of Orleans, we must step out of the hagiography and into the thick, metallic scent of 15th century mud and blood. We must confront a figure who was not merely a passive vessel for the divine, but a woman of terrifying resolve and a surprisingly dark, singular focus. The truth about Joan is far more uncomfortable than the myth of the porcelain saint. She was a teenager who emerged from the periphery of a fractured France, not with a message of peace, but with a sword and an uncompromising demand for total war. There is a visceral, almost frightening intensity to her rise. A girl who convinced battle-hardened mercenaries and cynical princes to follow her into the jaws of a theological and political meat grinder. To look at Joan is to look at a paradox, a symbol of ultimate valor who operated with a grim, apocalyptic urgency, believing she was the finger of God directed at the throat of the English. She wasn't just a mascot for the Valois. She was a military commander who advocated for aggressive, high-casualty frontal assaults when the veteran generals preached caution. Her valor was not a quiet internal strength. It was a loud, demanding, and often bloody manifestation of a conviction that bordered on the fanatical. When we peel back the layers of Victorian sanitization, we find a Joan who was intimately acquainted with the visceral reality of the siege, a woman who wept over the souls of her enemies while simultaneously ordering the charges that would send them to their graves. This is the duality of the Maid, the blinding light of her courage casting a shadow of absolute, uncompromising war. The darkness of Joan's nature is not found in malice, but in the absolute certainty that she was the arbiter of God's will on earth, a belief that made her both invincible and incredibly dangerous to the status quo. In the medieval mind, there was no greater terror than someone who claimed a direct line to the Creator, bypassing the Holy Mother Church and the feudal hierarchy. Joan didn't just hear voices. She acted upon them with a cold, tactical efficiency that stunned her contemporaries. She was known to be relentless, possessing a temperament that could shift from ecstatic prayer to a biting, soldierly fury in an instant. There is a recorded instance where she chased camp followers away with the flat of her sword, breaking the weapon in her zeal to maintain the moral purity of her army. This wasn't just good behavior. It was the enforcement of a holy crusade where the stakes were nothing less than the soul of France. Her noblesse, her nobility of spirit, was forged in the fires of a country that had been tearing itself apart for 100 years. She stepped into a vacuum of leadership and filled it with a terrifyingly pure vision of victory at any cost. She was a master of psychological warfare before the term existed, using her banner, her short-cropped hair, and her mail armor not as a costume, but as a psychological weapon to shatter English morale. The English didn't see a saint. They saw a pucelle of the devil, a witch whose presence on the battlefield felt like a supernatural curse. And in a way, she leaned into that darkness. She didn't shy away from the carnage of the Tourelle or the blood-soaked ramparts of Orléans. She was the first on the scaling ladders and the last to leave the field, carrying an arrow in her shoulder like a badge of divine endurance. Her valor was a dark flame, beautiful to her allies and incinerating to her foes, a reminder that the most powerful force in history isn't an army, but a single, unshakable idea housed in a human heart that refuses to break. To understand the grim reality of her mission, one must look at the sheer isolation of her position. Joan was a girl of 19, surrounded by men who either wanted to use her as a tool or burn her as a heretic. The court of Charles VII was a den of vipers, and Joan was the uncomfortable truth they couldn't ignore. Her darkness was the clarity she brought to a world of gray compromises. She demanded a coronation when the politicians wanted a truce. She demanded blood when the nobles wanted diplomacy. This singular focus is what made her so effective, but it's also what made her death inevitable. There is a haunting quality to her later campaigns, particularly the failed siege of Paris and her eventual capture at Compiègne. We see a Joan who is increasingly aware of her own mortality, yet she pushes forward with a grim, almost suicidal bravery. She was a woman who had seen the gentle Dauphin crowned, fulfilling her primary prophecy, yet she could not stop. The momentum of her divine mission had become a runaway train. The valor she displayed in her final months wasn't the exuberant joy of her early victories. It was the stoic, heavy courage of someone who knows the end is coming and chooses to walk toward it anyway. She was a warrior prophet who had outlived her political usefulness, becoming a liability to the very king she had made. The tragedy of Joan of Arc is that her dark intensity, the very thing that saved France, was the same trait that made her impossible to live with in a time of peace. She was a creature of the storm, and once the clouds began to part, the world had no place for a girl who spoke with the authority of the heavens and carried the stains of 100 battles on her soul. The trial of Joan of Arc remains one of the most intellectually violent episodes in the history of the Western world. A calculated, slow-motion execution, not of a body, but of a soul. To step into the courtroom at Rouen is to witness the darkness of the medieval machine grinding against the sheer, unbreakable diamond of Joan's will. This was not a trial about heresy. It was a political assassination cloaked in the robes of the Inquisition. The prosecutors, led by the careerist Pierre Cochon, weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a loophole in her divinity. They trapped her in a room for months, a 19-year-old girl isolated from any spiritual or legal counsel, surrounded by guards who threatened her with physical violation and subjected her to a psychological bombardment that would have shattered the most seasoned philosophers. This is where we see the darker side of her valor. Not the courage of the sword, but the courage of the mind. Her responses to their traps were not just clever, they were supernatural in their precision. When they asked her if she was in a state of grace, a question designed to damn her, no matter how she answered, she bypassed the snare with a chilling clarity. If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. In that moment, the peasant girl from Domremy became the intellectual superior of the finest minds of the University of Paris. She was fighting a war of words where the stakes were the stake. But beneath the transcripts lies a much bleaker reality, the crushing weight of her humanity under pressure. We often forget that Joan was terrified. There is a profound darkness in her moments of doubt, the instances where the silence of her voices in the stone cold of her cell felt like an abandonment by the very God she had bled for. Her valor here is stripped of its armor and its banners. It is the raw, naked bravery of a prisoner who refuses to lie even when the scent of burning wood is already in the air. The English and their Burgundian allies needed her to recant, to admit she was a fraud. Because if she was a saint, then their entire occupation of France was a sin against heaven. They attacked her identity, focusing obsessively on her male clothing, a practical necessity for a woman in a military camp and a protection against assault in prison, framing it as a monstrous violation of natural law. This obsession reveals the true fear of her accusers. They weren't afraid of her magic. They were afraid of her autonomy. They saw a woman who had bypassed every gatekeeper of the medieval world, and they had to prove she was a creature of the pit to restore the rightful order of things. The turning point, the most haunting part of her story, is her brief abjuration and her subsequent relapse. After months of torture and the sight of the executioner, Joan momentarily faltered, signing a document of renunciation in a moment of human frailty. But within days, the dark flame returned. She resumed her male dress and reaffirmed her voices, knowing with absolute certainty that doing so was a death sentence. This was her final, most potent act of valor. She chose to burn as a relapsed heretic rather than live as a lie. She reclaimed her narrative in the final hour, turning her execution into a cosmic theater. As the flames climbed the pyre in the old market of Rouen, she didn't scream for mercy from the judges. She called out to the saints. Even the English soldiers, who had come to watch a witch die, were reportedly moved to tears, with some fleeing the scene crying that they had burned a saint. The darkness of the fire was eclipsed by the light of a conviction so pure it terrified the men who lit it. Joan didn't just die. She transformed into a permanent, haunting presence in the European psyche. A reminder that you can kill the messenger, you can char the flesh, and you can throw the ashes into the Seine. But you cannot execute a truth whose time has come. Her valor was the ultimate defiance. She forced history to accept her on her own terms, leaving her enemies with the hollow victory of her death and the eternal shame of her martyrdom. The fire that consumed Joan's body was meant to be the final punctuation mark on a life of inconvenient brilliance, but instead, it served as the catalyst for a haunting that has lasted half a millennium. The rehabilitation trial that followed 25 years later was not a sudden burst of moral clarity from the Church, but a desperate political necessity for King Charles VII. To have been crowned by a burned heretic made his own throne a blasphemy. He needed Joan to be a saint not for her sake, but for his legitimacy. This is the final layer of the darkness surrounding her story. The realization that even in death, Joan was a pawn for the powerful. The testimony gathered during this second trial, from the neighbors of her childhood and the soldiers who fought by her side, reveals a woman who was intensely, almost painfully human. They spoke of a girl who loved the sound of bells, who was moved to tears by the sight of a wounded enemy, but who also possessed a gravity that silenced the lewd jests of the barracks. Her valor was a heavy burden, a mantle of responsibility she never asked for, but wore with a grim, stoic dignity that made the men around her feel small. We see a Joan who was the conscience of France, a mirror held up to a corrupt and dying age, reflecting back a purity that was too bright to be endured. This is the true darkness of Joan of Arc. She was the ultimate outsider. She was a woman in a man's war, a peasant in a noble's court, and a mystic in a lawyer's church. Her presence was a violent disruption of the natural order, a monstrous anomaly that forced the world to reckon with the possibility that God does not speak through hierarchies, but through the marginalized. Her moms and her valor are inseparable. You cannot have the girl who stood before the king at Chinon without the girl who stood before the fire at Rouen. She represents the terrifying power of the individual who refuses to be categorized. In the centuries since, we have tried to domesticate her, turning her into a nationalist icon, a feminist hero, or a stained glass figurine. But the real Joan remains elusive, standing in the shadows of history with a banner in one hand and a sword in the other, her eyes fixed on a horizon we cannot see. She reminds us that true noblesse is not inherited. It is forged in the decision to stand for something greater than oneself, even when the cost is everything. The legacy of Joan of Arc is a testament to the fact that the most noble acts are often the most maligned in their own time. Her story is a warning about the cruelty of systems and the resilience of the human spirit. She was a flicker of light in the dark ages that refused to be extinguished, a soul that was tempered in the furnace of war and purified in the fire of betrayal. When we look at Joan today, we don't just see a martyr. We see the raw potential of human conviction. We see the truth that valor is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, the ability to look at the stake, the fire, and the hatred of the world and to say, "I would rather die than be false to what I know to be true." She remains a haunting, beautiful, and fundamentally dark figure because she challenges us to ask what we would be willing to burn for. She is the eternal maid, the warrior saint, a reminder that in the theater of history, the most powerful role is often played by the one who refuses to follow the script. Her truth is not found in the gold of her statues, but in the ash and the grit of her resolve. A story of blood, iron, and a faith so absolute it turned a peasant girl into a legend that will outlast the stars. In the final reckoning, the image of Joan of Arc must be stripped of its romantic luster to reveal the bone-deep steel of a woman who was, by all accounts, a living anomaly. We have tried to make her soft, to make her palatable, But the Joan who actually existed was a creature of sharp edges and absolute, terrifying clarity. Her valor was not a quiet virtue. It was a loud, disruptive force that demanded the world bend to her vision of the divine. There is a specific, profound darkness in the way she was consumed by her own brilliance. She was a girl who had seen the apocalypse of her country and decided with a grim and singular determination that she would be the one to stop it. This wasn't the bravery of a child. It was the calculated courage of a martyr who knew from the moment she left Domremy that the path led to a pyre. She didn't stumble into her fate. She marched toward it with her eyes open, her hand on her sword, and a heart that had already made peace with the flames. This is the truth that history often hides, that greatness is rarely kind or comfortable. It is a violent, transformative power that destroys the vessel it inhabits. Joan's dark nature was her refusal to compromise with a world that was built on nothing but compromise. She stood in the center of a century of lies and spoke a truth that was so pure it was perceived as a threat to the fabric of reality. The valor we celebrate today was, in 1431, seen as the ultimate arrogance, the audacity of a peasant to dictate to kings, and the defiance of a woman to judge the church. We love her now because she is safe, because she is a statue that cannot speak back. But if Joan were to stand among us today, she would likely be just as terrifying, just as dark, and just as monstrous to our modern sensibilities as she was to the inquisitors at Rouen. She would still be the outsider, the one who hears a higher calling that ignores the noise of the crowd. She represents the terrifying weight of absolute conviction, the kind of faith that doesn't just move mountains, but burns them to the ground to clear a path for the spirit. As the curtain falls on the life of the Maid, we are left not with a saint in a niche, but with a ghost that refuses to be quieted. Joan of Arc is the patron saint of the impossible, a reminder that the world is changed not by those who follow the rules, but by those who are brave enough to be broken by them. Her story is the ultimate tragedy and the ultimate triumph, a narrative of a girl who was traded like a commodity, judged by cowards, and killed by the small-minded, only to rise from the ashes as the eternal conscience of humanity. She is the light that shines in the dark, but she is also the darkness that reminds us of the cost of that light. To remember Joan is to recognize that true noblesse is a fire that consumes everything it touches, leaving behind only the pure, indestructible essence of what it means to be truly, fearlessly alive. She was the Maid of Orleans, the prisoner of Rouen, and the martyr of France. But above all, she was the girl who dared to believe that she was enough to change the world. And in the end, she was right. The enduring power of Joan of Arc lies in the fact that she remains a mystery that no historian, no poet, and no politician can fully solve. She is the shadow in the cathedral, the grit in the machinery of the state, and the silent scream at the heart of the 100 years of madness. When we look into the abyss of her trial, we don't see the face of a victim. We see the reflection of a world that was too small for her spirit. The darkness we attribute to her was never hers. It was the darkness of the men who couldn't understand a power that didn't come from a crown or a purse. Her valor was a mirror that revealed their cowardice, and her purity was a light that exposed their corruption. They had to extinguish her to stop looking at themselves. But in their attempt to erase her, they granted her the only thing the world cannot take back: immortality. They thought they were disposing of a girl, but they were actually planting the seeds of a legend that would grow through the cracks of every empire that tried to claim her. As we conclude this reflection, we must accept that the truth about Joan of Arc is not found in the documents of the Inquisition or the decrees of the Vatican, but in the silence of the field at Domremy and the cold stones of the tower at Rouen. She is a reminder that the most profound strength is often the most isolated. To be the Maid of Orleans was to be alone in a crowd of thousands, to be the only person in a kingdom who truly believed that things could be different. Her life was a short, sharp shock to the system of history, a reminder that the impossible is merely that which has not yet been attempted by someone with enough courage to die for it. She was the storm that cleared the air, the fire that forged a nation, and the girl who proved that heaven is not a place you go to, but a standard you bring down to earth. So, let the statues stand and the incense burn. But never forget the real Joan, the girl who felt the weight of the sword, the heat of the fire, and the crushing pressure of the world's expectations, and who stood her ground anyway. She is the patron of the defiant, the icon of the unbreakable, and the eternal proof that even the darkest night can be shattered by a single, focused ray of light. Her name is carved into the soul of France, but her spirit belongs to anyone who has ever been told that they are too small, too young, or too powerless to make a difference. Joan of Arc was not a miracle because she was a saint. She was a miracle because she was a human who refused to be anything less than divine. The fire is long gone, but the warmth of her conviction still burns across the centuries. A dark and beautiful flame that will never, ever go out. The legend of Joan of Arc concludes not with a resolution, but with a lingering, restless question that echoes through the corridors of power and the quiet corners of our own hearts. We are forced to ask, what does it say about humanity that our greatest icons of valor must first be broken on the wheel of our own collective fear? We claim to admire her now, but we are the descendants of the same culture that built her pyre. The darkness of her story is a mirror held up to our own capacity for betrayal, our tendency to deify the dead while we crucify the living who dare to possess the same uncompromising spirit. Joan was not a figure of the past. She is a recurring frequency in the human experience, a warning that the truth is often a dangerous weapon in the hands of the pure. Her noblesse was a form of violence against the status quo, a spiritual insurrection that proved one person's conviction can be more effective than 1,000 years of tradition. She was the grain of sand that seized the gears of the world, and though she was crushed, the machine was never the same again. As the embers of her memory continue to glow, we must realize that Joan's victory was not found in the liberation of Orleans or the crowning of a king. It was found in her refusal to be silenced by the fire. The English thought they were destroying a witch. The French thought they were losing a mascot. But in that moment of ultimate sacrifice, Joan became something far more potent, a permanent haunting of the human conscience. She is the shadow that falls across every courtroom where justice is traded for policy, and every battlefield where the innocent are sacrificed for the pride of the powerful. Her valor was a dark gift to the world, a reminder that the cost of changing history is usually paid in blood, and that the only thing more terrifying than a girl with a sword is a girl with a mission that she is willing to die for. She was the architect of her own martyrdom, a master of her own destiny, who chose to be a legend rather than a survivor. We leave her now where we found her, standing at the intersection of myth and reality, draped in the armor of her own making, looking out at a world that still struggles to contain her. She is the eternal maid, the warrior who never retreated, the saint who was born in a stable and died in a furnace. To speak of Joan of Arc is to speak of the limits of human endurance and the infinite reach of the human soul. She remains our most beautiful paradox, a girl of 19 who taught the world how to live with honor and how to die with dignity. The flame that took her life didn't end her journey. It simply released her into the air we breathe, a permanent spark of defiance in an age of shadows. She is Joan, the daughter of God, the terror of England, the soul of France, and the eternal proof that, even in the deepest darkness, a single heart on fire can light the way for us all. The final, most haunting truth about Joan of Arc is that her execution was not the end of her story, but the beginning of an eternal investigation into the human soul. We are still at that trial in Rouen, perpetually acting as the judges, the witnesses, or the silent, complicit crowd. Every time we confront the darkness of her fate, we are testing our own limits of belief. Could a girl from a village truly hear the voices of the heavens? Or did she simply possess a psychological intensity so profound it mimicked the divine? Perhaps the answer doesn't matter. Whether her power came from the saints or from the raw, untapped potential of the human psyche. The result was the same, a total restructuring of history. Her valor was a disruption of the laws of probability. She was a peasant who should have died in obscurity, yet she became the most documented woman of the Middle Ages. This is the ultimate darkness, the terrifying realization that the world is far more malleable than we want to believe, and that a single, determined individual can tear the fabric of reality if they are willing to be consumed by the fire of their own conviction. We look back at the scorched earth of her life and see that she was never meant to survive the peace. She was a creature of the transition, a bridge made of bone and spirit between the old world of feudal lords and the new world of nations. The tragedy of her noblesse is that she was too pure for the world she saved. She was a masterpiece of human will that the world felt compelled to destroy because it couldn't stand the comparison. Her dark nature was simply the reflection of our own inadequacies. We called her a witch because we couldn't explain her genius, and we called her a saint because we couldn't live with the guilt of her murder. She stands today as a silent sentinel over our history, a girl who refused to be small, who refused to be silent, and who refused to be forgotten. She is the reminder that the most noble thing a human being can do is to be themselves so completely that the world has no choice but to either kill them or worship them. As we turn away from the pyre and the banners, let us carry with us the weight of her resolve. Joan of Arc is the patron of the impossible, not because she performed miracles, but because she was the miracle. She was the proof that a human being, armed with nothing but a vision and the courage to act upon it, can face down the concentrated power of an empire and an entire church and emerge victorious even in death. She remains the flame that never flickers, the voice that never falters, and the spirit that refuses to be quenched. Her story is a testament to the fact that while bodies are fragile and lives are short, an idea fueled by absolute valor is immortal. Joan of Arc didn't just fight for France. She fought for the right of every soul to listen to its own voices, to follow its own path, and to burn with its own unique, dark, and beautiful. The legacy of Joan of Arc is a shadow that stretches across the centuries, growing longer as the sun sets on the age of absolute certainty. We find ourselves standing in the cold, gray dawn of a world she helped create, yet we are still no closer to touching the essence of the girl who stood in the fire. To speak of her truth is to speak of the darkness of a vision so blinding it rendered the rest of the world obsolete. She didn't just fight a war, she conducted a symphony of human will that resonated through the stones of every cathedral in Europe. Her valor was a heavy, visceral thing, a weight she carried with the stoicism of a veteran and the heartbeat of a child. When we look at the truth of Joan, we must face the terrifying possibility that she wasn't just a saint or a girl, but a force of nature, a rare atmospheric event that occurs when a human heart becomes so pressurized by conviction that it begins to generate its own gravity. She pulled the stars down to the mud of France and forced the world to look up. And for that crime of perspective, she was sacrificed. This is the ultimate closing of the ledger, the realization that the world will always fear the person who cannot be bought, cannot be reasoned with, and cannot be broken. Joan's dark nature was her absolute lack of fear in the face of the abyss. She looked at the king and saw a man. She looked at the inquisitors and saw cowards. She looked at the fire and saw a gateway. This level of autonomy is the most dangerous thing a human can possess. It is the valor that transcends the battlefield and enters the realm of the eternal. She was the first modern individual, the first person to stand before the gathered might of the old world and say, "I know who I am, and your judgment cannot reach me." That is the secret she whispered into the flames at Rouen, a secret that has been vibrating through history ever since. She left us with a blueprint for how to be free, even in a cage, how to be heard, even in a tomb, and how to be remembered, even when the world tries to turn your name into ash. As we conclude this journey into the crimson and gold of her life, we are left with a final, echoing silence. The banners have rotted, the swords have rusted, and the kingdom she saved has transformed 1,000 times over. But the maid remains. She stands at the edge of our consciousness, a girl of 19 who changed the shape of the human soul. She is the truth that survives the fire. She is the valor that outlasts the war. She is the reminder that even when the darkness is at its deepest, the most powerful weapon in the universe is a single, solitary yes to a calling that only you can hear. Her story is over, but her mission continues every time a person refuses to lie to their own conscience. Joan of Arc didn't just die for France. She died for the light in all of us that the world tries to put out. And as long as we remember her, that light will continue to burn, dark, beautiful, and absolutely, undeniably free. This has been the full, deep dive reflection on the life, the darkness, and the valor of Joan of Arc. If you've traveled this far into the fire with me, perhaps you've seen a flicker of that same resolve within yourself. History is more than just names and dates. It's a mirror. What did you see when you looked at the maid? Was she a victim, a victor, or something else entirely? Thank you for listening to this meditation on the blood and spirit of the Maid of Orleans. If this exploration of history's darker truths resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. We are all judges in the trial of history. Let us try to be more merciful than the men of 1431. Until next time, remember, the truth doesn't need a crown to be royal, and a heart on fire can never truly be extinguished. See you in the next one.